Dust curled like old paper in the wind, winding through the bones of the dying prairie town as the noon sun blistered the wooden eaves and curled the porch slats of the sheriff's office. A woman stepped off the eastbound stagecoach, her figure swallowed by a dress meant for someone else. Pale cream muslin, delicate mother-of-pearl buttons. None of it belonged to Lydia Whitlock, yet it clung to her like memory. The hem dragged in the dust, fraying at the corners, as if the road itself refused to forget who the dress was meant for. Caroline had been the one to answer the advertisement. Caroline, with her golden hair and cherry pit laugh, who once danced barefoot in churchyards and told Lydia she'd never settle for a man with a crooked nose, let alone a ruined face. But Caroline had vanished before sunrise, leaving only the dress, a half-written apology, and the hard fact that the rent was unpaid and their mother's grave unmarked. Lydia had folded the note with stiff fingers, packed a single satchel, and boarded the coach in silence. Now, she stood in the dry shade of the Mercantile's awning, feeling every eye upon her. Whispers rolled like tumbleweeds. Asterisk is at the bride. Didn't she look different in the picture? Asterisk behind her, the sign creaked in the wind. McCrae's Ranch, 6 miles north, and with a breath that felt like it might split her ribs, she began walking. The road to Elias McCrae's ranch was ribboned with the ghosts of wildflowers and broken fences. The hills undulated gently, the way grief sometimes does, quiet but always there. By the time the house rose into view, a hulking silhouette against the horizon, Lydia's shoes were stained red with dirt, and her skin burned from sun and uncertainty. He was already on the porch, a tall shadow beneath the rafters. Elias McCrae did not stand to greet her. He remained seated in a chair too wide for its own legs, his hat brim shadowing the ruin of his left cheek. The rumors had been cruel, and not without truth. Fire had taken part of his face, branding him with ridges of melted skin, a twisted corner of lip, and a stillness in one eye that made him appear perpetually halfway between fury and sleep. "You're not her," he said after a long silence, voice like gravel raked through whiskey. Lydia met his gaze, heart beating slow and hard. "No," she said, the word small but rooted. "But I came." The silence that followed was not awkward. It was heavy, like an anvil between them. Then Elias rose. His gait was limping, not from injury but from reluctance. He nodded once and motioned her inside. The house was clean but unlived in. The furniture was thick with polish, corners untouched by dust, but the walls bore no photographs, no marks of joy or memory. In the kitchen, he gestured to a room down the hall. "Yours," he said. "You stay as long as you want. No expectations. Just keep quiet. I don't need more noise." She didn't ask what noise he meant. The walls answered for him, the echoes of a woman long gone, of fire and screams, and the silence that follows both. That night, Lydia sat on the edge of the bed that wasn't hers, wearing a nightdress that wasn't quite hers, in a life she had not chosen but had accepted. She thought of Caroline somewhere on a train, laughing into a stranger's shoulder, and of the way their mother used to run her fingers through Lydia's hair when she had nightmares. Now, there was only the wind outside the window and the slow groan of the ranch house settling in its bones. In the mornings, she worked. Quietly. Thoroughly. She scrubbed the floorboards and baked cornbread from memory. She mended a tear in a curtain without asking. Elias watched her from the barn sometimes, leaning against a post like a figure carved from old oak. He never asked for anything, never offered either. But small things began to shift. A basket of apples appeared in the kitchen. A woolen shawl, folded neatly by the door. One morning, she found her name etched faintly on a carved plank above her room. Lydia. Still, the town didn't forget. Sheriff Dalton Reeve rode up one afternoon under the guise of checking fences. He had a face like rusted iron and a voice that implied knowing too much. "You're not the girl in the ad?" he said, spitting tobacco into the dirt. "No," Lydia answered, her hand still in the dishwater. He scratched his chin. "You're the one who stayed. That's worth something, maybe." She said nothing. But that night, she caught Elias staring at his reflection in the window, half a face ghosted in the glass, and turning from it like it hurt to look. One evening, she found the old rocking chair in the back shed, its seat split and arms weather-warped. She ran her fingers over the grain, worn smooth in places where love had once sat. The next morning, it was gone. 2 days later, it returned to the porch, whole again. She didn't say thank you, but she sat in it every dusk, hands in her lap, eyes on the sky. The days folded into one another like pages dog-eared by routine. But the nights were slower. At supper, they began to speak, not of anything vital, just weather, crops, the coyote tracks near the fence line. And when Lydia laughed softly at a story about his mule refusing to walk backward, Elias blinked like he hadn't heard laughter in years. Then came the letter. Folded once, the paper creased by carelessness. Caroline's handwriting bold and careless. She was in California, married to a traveling photographer. Pregnant. I hope he's not mad, she wrote. You're better at quiet things than me, anyway. Maybe he won't notice. Lydia stood in the twilight, letter shaking in her hand. She burned it in the hearth, watched the flames eat her sister's carelessness. That night, Elias brought in wood and paused at the threshold. I know, he said. She looked up, throat tight. I knew you weren't her the second I saw you. But you stayed. Lydia turned from the fire, shadows dancing over her cheeks. Do you want me gone? He looked away. No. She didn't move toward him, didn't speak again. But as he left, his footsteps slower than usual, Lydia reached out, touched the armrest of the rocking chair, and found it warm. Outside, wind rustled the prairie grass like an old hymn rising. And far down the road, just beyond the hills, someone else was coming. A soft frost clung to the prairie grass, silvering the hills as dawn broke with the hush of held breath. Lydia stepped barefoot onto the porch, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, steam rising from her cup. The air was still except for the low thrum of distant cattle and the creak of the windmill, its blades slicing the morning in slow rhythm. She breathed it in, the stillness, the smell of pine smoke and distant hay. It no longer felt foreign. The land had taken her quietly, like water takes stone. Inside, the house held warmth, not just from the fire, but from something else, something unspoken that hung between her and Elias like a shared thought. They moved around each other without need for instruction. He fixed the barn roof without asking. She stitched the loose buttons on his coat. In silence, they built a rhythm, a language written not in words, but in presence. One morning, a stray dog appeared at the edge of the pasture, ribs sharp, one ear torn. Lydia left a bowl of scraps by the fence. The next day, the bowl was empty. On the third, the dog let her sit nearby, though it flinched when she reached out. She didn't try again, just sat, humming softly. That evening, Elias left a rough-hewn board and nails beside the porch. A doghouse followed a week later. No one mentioned it. In town, things were less gentle. Lydia ventured in for supplies, her posture straight but inwardly knotted. Women watched from behind lace curtains, their voices trailing after her like burrs in fabric. That's her, not the pretty one, the other sister. They say he bought her silence. She wears that dress like it still don't fit. She said nothing. But that night, she scrubbed her hands raw at the basin. Elias, watching from the doorway, didn't speak. He only placed a jar of salve on the table and turned away. The dog, she'd begun calling him Clover, followed her to the fields now, limping gently on one back leg. She walked with him, her fingers trailing wheat stalks, each day soaking in silence that felt less like absence and more like prayer. At night, she sat beside Elias under the porch's low lantern. Sometimes he carved while she read. Other times, they simply watched the stars scrape across the sky. Then the storm came, a prairie squall with wind like a hammer and rain that screamed through the eaves. Lydia had left Clover's bowl on the porch, and when the wind knocked it flying, she ran outside without thought. Mud sucked at her boots, rain flattened her hair against her cheeks. She called for him, over and over. A whimper answered from beneath the collapsed chicken coop. She was still dragging him out when Elias reached her, his coat flung around her shoulders as if it were part of him. He scooped the dog in one arm, her in the other, and carried them both to shelter. Inside, he set the dog down first. Then he looked at her, dripping, shaking, lips blue. Without a word, he wrapped a blanket around her, placed her hands near the fire, and sat beside her. Their knees touched. His fingers trembled slightly as he poured her tea. "I told myself not to care," he said, staring into the flames. "It's easier that way." Lydia didn't answer. Instead, she reached out and laid her hand over his. Rough skin, heat like coals beneath bark. He didn't pull away. Outside, the storm passed, and the ranch exhaled its hell breath. But something had shifted. The next day, they cleaned the coop together, Elias murmuring instructions without his usual guarded tone. Lydia found herself humming again, absent-mindedly. When he paused, she looked up to find him watching her, not with pity, not with possession, but with something resembling awe. He turned away too quickly, cheeks flushed deeper than the sunburns on his neck. Days folded into weeks. Lydia planted herbs in an old trough behind the barn. Mint, lavender, parsley. The kitchen began to smell like something soft and growing. Elias built a bench beside the trough. One evening, he joined her there, holding 2 chipped mugs of cider. "You remind me of someone," he said. "My mother. Before the fire, she used to sing to the hens." "I don't sing. You hum." They sat in silence for a moment longer. "She'd have liked you," he added, voice low. "You don't flinch when you look at me." Lydia turned to him, eyes steady. "You're not something to flinch at." The words sat between them like roots pushing into earth. He nodded once, the movement almost imperceptible. But peace in the West rarely lingers. Word traveled faster than good intentions. Sheriff Reeve arrived the following week, saddle dusty, badge catching the sun like accusation. He dismounted slow, like a man preparing for a blow. "Heard tell your bride ain't who she's meant to be," he said. Elias stood from the porch, his shadow long, coat catching in the breeze. "She's who chose to be here. That's what counts." "She tricked you," the sheriff pressed. Lydia stepped forward, shoulders drawn back. "I didn't trick him. I took my sister's place." She ran. I stayed. Reeve studied her, jaw tight. "Town's got rules, girl. Truth matters." "She's the truth," Elias said, voice like a closing door. "And that's the last I'll say." Reeve didn't argue. He tipped his hat and left. But the words echoed long after his hooves faded. That night, Elias opened a door Lydia hadn't dared to try. A room filled with dust and stillness. A small cradle. A blanket draped carefully across the edge. A nursery that never knew a child. "She was with child when she died," he said. "The fire took them both. I built this room with my own hands, every board." He paused. Then I closed it. Couldn't bear the silence. Lydia stepped inside, her breath catching on the edges of old grief. She ran her fingers across the wooden cradle, the smooth rocker he'd carved with calloused hands. She turned slowly to him. "You didn't need saving, Elias," she whispered. "You needed someone to stay." He looked at her, his face unreadable, until he lifted a trembling hand and touched the side of his scar. "Do you see me?" he asked, the words barely more than breath. And Lydia, with all the certainty of moonlight, replied, "Finally." Outside, the prairie wind shifted. Clover barked once at the hills, then quieted. And far away, just past the edge of the fence line, a horse's silhouette appeared, rider slumped, saddlebag torn, and golden hair tangled in the wind.